director of the Eurasia program. I'm delighted to welcome another Eurasian. And his most recent book, which I do hope you will buy, sorry, back to front, of course, is The Ukraine War and Eurasian Integration. So, Glenn, welcome. So could I begin by asking you perhaps simply to describe your book and its central thesis? You're muted, Glenn.
Sorry about that. Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a big fan of and regular reader of the Quincy Institute, so it's a great privilege. So the book is, about, as the title would suggest, about the Ukraine war and world order. So, so I want to explain why some of this reason why all sides in these conflicts are willing to take such tremendous risks, as we're all seeming willing to risk even nuclear war for the outcome of this conflict. And it's also worth exploring the discourse coming not just from Moscow, but also from Western capitals, where they effectively describe the future of the world order to depend on this. And I agree with this assessment that it is about world order. I think the Ukraine war signals or represents two things. First, I think it's a symptom of a collapsing world order, which is the unipolar world order established after the Cold War, which has come to an end. The war itself has intensified the transition towards multipolarity, which is being spearheaded primarily through a Eurasian format. So in the bigger context, I look at world order, and the modern world order can be said to have been established with the Peace of Westphalia after the 30-year war. That is, European hegemon was effectively over, and we established a new European order then based on multipolarity, so many powers balancing each other. And since those days, we've had this tension between having a multipolar system with security competition and the impulse, if you will, for some actors to desire to establish a new Pax Romana, a new hegemon to temper or mitigate the international anarchy. And of course, this is the world order we had after the Cold War, in which we organized an international system organized around U.S. global primacy, again for these main two reasons: to mitigate the power competition between the great powers, but also elevate liberal democratic values. But as I argue, was quite predictable, that order was based on very weak foundation, and it was very temporary, and it also directly contributed to the war in Ukraine, and it's also a key reason why the West is so reluctant to even make any compromise or negotiation over the war, and why we're instead willing to fight seemingly to the bitter end.
It's interesting. I find that even compared to prolonged periods during the Cold War, when, after all, the Soviet army was in the very heart of Europe, 100 miles from the French border, 50 miles from the Rhine. And yet, European countries were prepared to distance themselves from the US to some extent. De Gaulle, obviously, in France. Britain refused to join America in Vietnam. Now it seems that European governments are in lockstep pretty much at present with US policies. Why do you think that this, even as the US indeed gets relatively weaker and more adventurist, there seems to be this consolidation of European support for America? Do you have any ideas why this has occurred?
No, it's an interesting impulse. I sometimes argue that it perhaps a lack of a political imagination for alternatives, because we haven't really had a world order which wasn't Western centric. But you're very correct. We used to stand up to the United States, or push back at least, for much longer. If we refer it, for example, to the Ukraine war, we knew already back in 2008, the European leaders were quite open that this was a mistake to try to push NATO further. They pushed against the United States. It was recognized where this would lead. But now you see, step by step, they're becoming more and more compliant, if you will. And for me, this is the big irony, because in a under the unipolarity, the Europeans, they had some ability to pursue some strategic autonomy, or they call it European sovereignty, in order to distance themselves a bit from the United States. But once the world becomes more multipolar, the first impulse is to withdraw, I guess, under US protection. And it's a strange action, because in a multipolar system, if you want to be an independent pole of power, you really have to diversify your economic connectivity to many actors, because if you're only dependent on one state, which is more powerful than you, then you're going to have asymmetrical interdependence, and you're going to be, as Macron would say, become vassals. And so we're seeing all the countries around the world pursuing a multi-vector foreign policy to diversify their economic ties, exactly so they can have more independent foreign policy. The only exception are actually the Europeans. We are cutting ourselves off the Russians. Now we're cutting ourselves off from China. And with it, we see the loss of wealth, prosperity, becoming increasingly dependent on the United States, and overall becoming quite irrelevant in the world. So it's exactly the opposite of what you would expect would happen under a multipolar system.
Do you think that political developments within Europe are likely to change this in the years to come? I mean, one certainly sees in several countries, in public opinion, but also particularly in Germany, in political parties, a pretty strong pushback against US agendas and in favor of a compromised peace in Ukraine. How powerful do you think this tendency is within Europe, and what are its chances of changing things?
Well, I think there's a growing disconnect between the political elites and the public. Now, I've often drawn a comparison between the 19th century and now. That is, after a period of globalization, you often see political elites form more loyalties towards more international capital and international institutions, becoming less accountable to their own public. And I think over time now, it's very hard to say that the European governments sufficiently represents national interest. I think this is becoming quite obvious. In Baerbock in Germany, for example, even told their voters, I will support, what she said in English, I will support Ukraine no matter what my voters say. So this kind of, yes, represents the mentality often that is communicated. Now, obviously, when political leaders stop representing national interests sufficiently, then, well, what happens? Well, you're going to have a huge vacuum emerging. Alternatives will fill it. And this is already happening across Europe. We're often refer to them as populist. But in Germany, as you said, the main opposition party now is AfD. They considering banning it because they don't know what else to do. In France, Macron's party came in third, and they still insist on ruling. So it's a very strange situation, but it's not durable. So I think they're holding on, but it's going to be at some point. I think a lot of these governments will begin to be swept away.
You say, and in my view, quite rightly, that the US-led liberal order, if you can call it that, is in the process of collapse. But do you see the Westphalian system, if you can call it that, as capable of generating, because this, of course, is the great critique of the Westphalian order or of the post-American order, that it will not, in fact, be capable of ensuring basic stability and security in the world, and that it would, in fact, lead to another nationalist free-for-all. What is your view of this critique?
Well, it's worth noting that the initial Westphalia was a European order, so it recognized sovereign equality among European powers, but not the rest of the world. So they were not considered to be sovereign entities. So it facilitated this sovereign inequality. It allowed for empires to be built. I think this new Westphalia, which is emerging, is quite different because in this new Westphalian system, many of the leading powers are even non-Western, such as China and India. Now, obviously, it's a system of more anarchy, less concentration of power. So I think it's going to have naturally have a lot of tensions and conflicts. But I do think that also Eurasia, this multipolar system which is emerging, it has mechanisms effectively built in for countries with an incentive to promote, to harmonize. So I often use the example comparing with Russia and China. That is, both of them have some competing interests, but if they want to integrate this Eurasian landmass, the Chinese can't do it without the Russians can't do it without China. So I think this is why you find that they're pursuing some harmonization of their interest, whether if it's in Central Asia or in other places. So but I do recognize there's obviously going to be a lot of tension, but the unipolarity is yes, is simply the foundations are simply gone.
How do you see what's happening in the Middle East as affecting this process?
A major disruption, as war tends to be. I think for for a multipolar system, the Chinese had an interest in pushing for more peaceful cooperation between, for example, the Arabs and Iran. And this is simply because, if they want to reach out to Iran, they don't want to alienate the Arabs, so they try to do both, which is why when, for example, BRICS expanded, they take both United Arab Emirates, ideally Saudi Arabia, as well as Iran. But I think this war causes huge divisions, huge conflicts. But I think it's also it's seen as a reflection of a hegemon in decline as well, because I think many people see a huge part of the problem of Israel exactly being that it was backed by the US for so many decades, and it never really had to make any compromises with its opponents, be it effectively as recognizing a Palestinian state. And I think at the core, this is where the problem has built up. That is, how do you deal with a greater Israel as it is without a Palestinian state, where you want it to be a ethno state, but only half the population would be Jewish. What do you do with all the Palestinians? I think there's not that many options. You can either have an apartheid system, or you can ethnically cleanse some of the population. But beyond this, is not many political settlements. So I think this has been brewing for quite some time. And but of course, any war in the Middle East is going to be a huge disruption to the integration of the Eurasian continent.
We actually do have a question from the audience about whether you see any equivalence between Russian actions in Ukraine and policy and Israeli actions in the Middle East.
Well, I think they're both symptoms of the unipolar world order, which failed to address a lot of the key problems. Now, like I said, with the Middle East, I think the problem is when there's a hegemon, there's no necessity to compromise or harmonize the interest between the different actors of the region. I think in Russia, the problem was different. That is, after the Cold War, we were looking at how to build the new Europe, and we were pursuing essentially two parallel world orders. One, we had agreed based on the Helsinki Accords and the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990 to, as well as the establishment of the OSCE, to establish an inclusive Europe, more or less based on Gorbachev's common European home. And this was based on sovereign equality, a Europe without dividing lines, and one which Russia would belong to. But then parallel to it, which took over, was NATO expansion, and this was a manifestation of the ambitions for unipolarity, in which effectively all countries in Europe would belong without Russia, except Russia, which is the largest state. And this has become a key source of instability, as instead of removing the dividing lines, we merely moving them closer and closer to Russian borders. So we restore dividing lines. We're not pursuing indivisible security, and it's also Europe where we don't have sovereign equality anymore. Instead, we have the rules-based international order, in which is founded on sovereign inequality, in which some states should be more sovereign than others. So I think that this is really what sparked it, and I often make the point that this has become a controversial argument now, but if we remember back in the 1990s, this was kind of common sense. Even in the book cite Bill Clinton from January of '94 when he argued this NATO expansion could revive the Cold War by redividing Europe. His U.S. Secretary of Defense, was it William Perry, he also making the same argument that this would be a betrayal of Russia. It would possibly start a new conflict, a new Cold War, and also confirming that there was a huge agreement on this within the Clinton administration. But it was okay to alienate the Russians because they were weak and they were going to get only weaker. So I think that this and this is the problem when you have this much concentration of power in a hegemon. You don't need to make any compromises anymore. So we couldn't find a place for Russia in Europe. Effectively, Estonia with 1.3 million can have a seat at the table, but not the largest state. So it was obviously a recipe for disaster, and I think the same applied for the Middle East. So I think that's a key similarity.
Artin, you had some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Glenn, and congratulations on the book. I was curious to ask you, what specific challenges internally across Eurasia do you see for Eurasian World Order, as you call it, and how are these being overcome, or how could we expect to see these be overcome in future?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I think, in terms of the main tensions, I think the main conflict now is effectively that we haven't actually transitioned to a multipolar world. And I think that's one of the key tensions, that the West would like to restore the unipolar order, which is why when you listen to many political or military leaders, especially in Washington, they refer to this war as, if we can knock out the Russians from the rank of great powers, then we can focus on China. So the main drive appears to be to restore the primacy that was achieved after the Cold War, that this has to be the source of peace, that there's no imagination to move beyond it. Meanwhile, not just Russia, China, but we see also by the long line of countries which want to join BRICS, that there's a stronger interest in having a multipolar system in which countries would have more control over the foreign policy. So I think at the moment, this is why the world is being pulled into opposite direction, which is also why we're having this vacuum in terms of what should be the rules and acceptable behavior. And at the epicenter of this, I think, is Ukraine, because whichever side seen to win are able to more or less define the future world order. But one can argue once multipolarity has been established, I think it will always have a system of suspicion within it. That is, country fearing each other, looking to disrupt relations. So it's not going to be, I think, what is called a stairway to heaven, but I do think it represents a much more stable system as opposed to bipolarity or unipolarity.
So building on that, you mentioned in your book, and as demonstrated through history, during these periods where there is this transition, there tends to be more disorder. And as we see today, there are these wars ongoing, and there's potential for more to occur. So how do small states across Eurasia deal with this reality of changing from this unipolar era to one that we hope to see more multipolarity in? What challenges do they face, and how are they trying to overcome them?
Well, as I mentioned before, the ideal position to take and the opportunity you have under multipolarity is exactly to diversify your ties. This is why yeah, I would consider Turkey to be a good example, because everyone keeps trying to guess which camp they're going to join. Are they going to stay with the American camp, go to the Chinese or Russians? But if you talk to their ambassadors, then they always say the same thing. No, our goal is not to have to choose. And I think in order to exercise an autonomous foreign policy, and I think this is what you see from many countries around the region. They want to not just diversify in terms of military, but they're looking to diversify primarily then the economic connectivity, which is also why BRICS is so interesting. That is, they want to diversify their technological partnerships, their access to natural resources, physical transportation corridors, their banks they're using, the payment systems. Everything from commodity exchanges to the currencies. So it's I think it's quite important to for them to diversify and not get caught up in effectively becoming another Ukraine, becoming a piece or a pawn in this great power rivalry. Because I even cite Gramsci in this in the book as he pointed out the same problem when the old world is effectively dying and the new world hasn't been born, that this period is full of instability. And I think that's the period we're currently in. So I think a lot of countries are seeking simply to avoid becoming pieces in this by not committing to any one block. I think that's the way they're going forward.
We have a question about the role of democracy and I suppose the safety of democracy under this new Westphalian order. Of course, the Biden administration and to a lesser extent the Europeans have cast world affairs today in terms of tension or rivalry between a block of autocracies and the democratic, or as we used to call it, the free world. But I mean, in a world with much greater Russian and Chinese power, would democracy, in fact, be endangered in your view?
Well, I guess yes and no. I think a key problem, as many people argued already in the 90s, even Brzezinski, on when he was making the case for unipolarity, was that over time, that the United States wouldn't be able to have, effectively empire and democracy at the same time. So I think the unipolar world order on its own has been quite harmful for democracy, and we tend to use democracy, this division between dividing the world into democracy versus authoritarianism. It's a way of doing the recasting the world as good versus evil, capitalist versus communist. So it's a way of simplifying and redividing into blocks. Now, obviously, a lot of the new centers of power do not have the democratic traditions of the Western countries. Well, especially not Britain and the United States, who have longer tradition of democracies. But I see it having other benefits. That is, it's also rejecting universalism, because what's worth remembering, one of the reasons why the Holy Roman Empire would come apart is because they no longer, not just the distribution of power changed, but also their ability to represent universal values. That is, if everyone's not a Catholic, they can't represent everyone. And that this is also a key factor of the Westphalian system, which is you recognize distinctive civilizations, distinctive cultures, so they all have their own path to development. And this is largely what also defines the Eurasian path or format for Westphalia, as the problem under the unipolar era was we were arguing that liberal democracy are universal values. Now, and by also saying that the political West are the champion of this value, we created a system based on sovereign inequality, as I mentioned before, this rules-based international order, where the West can have sovereignty for itself, but others will have limited sovereignty, which is why after the Cold War we introduced these ideas like democracy promotion, humanitarian interventionism, global war on terror, all implicitly having limited sovereignty for the rest. So I think in a large respect this contradicts democracy if states don't actually have their own sovereignty. And even go back and make the comparison to the debate they had in the 19th century, where you had liberals in Britain, some saying, well, liberal empire, either it facilitates liberalism, but others criticized it, that the empire itself undermined the principles of liberalism. So, but overall, there seems to be almost based on conservative principles in Eurasia, the idea that there shouldn't be universalism. And we even see this from the Chinese, which I always make the argument that this is something we should be happy about, because they have this global civilization initiative in which they actually say that all civilizations have their own path to development, and it's not for one civilization to dictate to another. Now, if the Chinese had hegemonic ambitions to effectively replace a new hegemon after the US, they would say the opposite. They would say there are universal values, we are the champion of it, and this is what facilitates a system based on sovereign inequality, but they're not. So this is one can see both pros and cons, I guess, for the development of democracy. But dividing the world into democracies and authoritarianism, I think, is a radical simplification, which also divides the world into good and bad, which makes it impossible to actually have diplomacy, compromises, because as we always learn in battles between good and evil, you can't compromise with evil. You create peace by defeating evil. So I think it's a very dangerous worldview to take, very Manichaean.
I have a question. Of course, within what it regards as its own sphere, the former Soviet Union, Russia, as one could say America does in Central America, certainly does wish to qualify in some respects the sovereignty of its neighbors, at least when it comes to their external alignment. So how far do you see Russian ambitions as going in that regard?
Well, I would define the concept more specifically, because when we talk about sphere of influence, we often argue that the Russians demand a sphere of influence. Now, this usually denotes an exclusive influence, such as during the Cold War, where we divide into blocks. But there's I would contest that this is necessarily what they demand, and this goes back to actually an argument by Medvedev when he was president, back in the day, in which he argued we don't need spheres of interest. Spheres of interest. We need spheres of influence. We don't need spheres of influence, which is exclusive influence. We need spheres of interest. And where it differentiates is they're not demanding exclusive influence, but they're demanding that when you operate on Russia's borders, in its neighborhood, that you also accommodate Russian interest. So, of course, this could all be a lot of talk, but countries usually develop policy of sphere of influence if they demand hegemony. And this is also, I think, why we made a huge mistake 10 years ago when we predicted that the Chinese and Russian relationship wouldn't work because they would clash over Central Asia. It didn't happen, I think, because the Russians were happy to accommodate China, and the Chinese were willing to not step on the toes of the Russians. So, and even the Russians were inviting more other countries in, for example, India into Central Asia, because that would have more big powers. Overall, Russia's influence would diminish, but it would also prevent China from dominating. So, and as long as this country respected Russia's interest on its own borders, in other words, a sphere of interest, then Russia didn't demand exclusive influence in any way. But it's also, I think, in the West, we have to be honest with ourselves, because when we operate on Russia's borders, we tend to always have the same goal, that we should decouple the region from Russia. We should free them. So when we deal with Ukraine, we have to drive a wedge between Ukraine and Russia. When we talk about Central Asia, it always comes down to splitting the region from Russia. The Chinese, the Indians, they're not doing this. And I think that because they respect this sphere of interests, not influence, I think that's a key reason. I think that has to be the foundation of a Westphalian order as well, recognizing sovereignty. But we also have to be honest that not all countries have the freedom for everything. If you look at Mexico, for example, they have the freedom to engage in any political or economic ties with anyone they want. However, I don't think it's correct to argue that they have the freedom to begin to accommodate Chinese and Russian military bases to put missiles and weapon system and ports of hostile nations to the US on its borders. So, and yeah, the US would never accept this. And again, this is quite reasonable. So, but this doesn't mean that the Americans demand exclusive influence over Mexico, but they do demand a sphere of interest. And I think that's what we also have to accommodate for other great powers, such as the Russians and the Chinese.
Yeah. I mean, part of the problem is that the European Union does have relatively successful set of internal rules governing relations between its members, in which mutual interests are accommodated, although of course the most powerful states like Germany have a disproportionate degree of, should we say, seeing that their interests are respected. But when it comes to Russia, the European Union expected Russia to play by these rules without, of course, Russia being a member of the European Union. So whereas Germany can secure its vital interests through the European Union, Russia obviously cannot. And therefore the Russians have always said, well, no, we will then play by American international rules, though perhaps not on as broad a canvas. But I think that's been a fundamental problem, lack of recognition and analysis in Europe.
Yeah, no, sorry.
No, go on, please.
Oh no, well, I was just going to say this is also a challenge for some countries within Europe, because it's important to recognize what the European Union brings in terms of value to members, and its collective bargaining power, which is why the EU initially also was an instrument to have parity with the United States. So collectively we would stand side by side with the US, so it wouldn't be this asymmetrical relationship. But if you look at within the EU, countries like Hungary, yes, the attraction is they have collective bargaining power, but the disadvantage is you have big countries within the bloc, such as Germany, or France, which can, well, more and more step over them. So from their perspective, they're also reaching more towards Eurasia now, because they would like to diversify. They want the EU for collective bargaining power, but if the asymmetrical interdependence they have with the Germans and French translates into too intrusive influence, they would like to lean a little bit towards China as well, towards India, towards Russia, to not to go against the West, but simply to be able to diversify, to augment their own autonomy. And yeah, I think you're correct as well with the Russians. This was a key problem with creating Europe without Russia. How can you possibly do it? Because we wanted Russia to look towards the West for leadership, but they shouldn't have a seat at the table. In other words, we created a Europe where Russia shouldn't have a veto, so they had no voice in institutions. This is how can you possibly do this? Well, you need asymmetrical interdependence, which is why we would like the Russians to be dependent on our technologies, transportation corridor, banks and currency and everything, and we should be as little dependent on them as possible, which is why we tried for 20 plus years to shed our dependence on Russian energy. And so we try to manipulate this symmetry of dependence, and but at the end now, with of course was Ukraine. That's why I said in 2014 they gave up on Greater Europe. So this whole European model, they said, is dead. We have to go Greater Eurasia, and this happened to be exactly at the same time as the Chinese were beginning to challenge American economic leadership around 2013-14 with the Belt and Road Initiative, China 2025, and all these other initiatives.
And on that, we have a question: how close do you expect China and Russia to become in future? At the moment, I mean, this is clearly a partnership, but still a limited partnership. I myself have often pushed back against the overuse of the term alliance in discussing international affairs. NATO is an alliance, at least theoretically, and according to NATO's Article 5, we do have to fight to defend each other. Clearly, China does not feel a commitment to fight alongside Russia in Ukraine, and Russia does not feel a commitment, to fight alongside China where China wants to fight at the same. But I mean, clearly there are, or we have created some very strong common interests. But how solid, how close do you see this relationship now, and how close do you think it will become in future?
Well, I don't think it's an alliance, but this is also a very positive thing because, as we learned from the Westphalian system, one of the reasons why it breaks down is because this is when countries form peacetime alliances. This is when this ability to balance becomes disrupted because the loyalty goes primarily to the exclusive alliances as opposed to the wider international system, which is why you also see now more loyalty often to NATO as a bloc as opposed to the rules of the UN. But of course, the Chinese do not officially, they repudiate the whole or reject this whole idea of alliances. But it's also important to define alliances because alliances tends to be country A and B against country C. And I don't think this is what we're seeing at all, which is why the Russians and Chinese refuse to even refer to it as an alliance. They call it, more than an alliance because they're building a new economic system for a multipolar world, which isn't reliant on an adversary. And again, with the alliance, I think it's worth even looking at BRICS because there's no reason why the US should fear BRICS as an alliance against the US because, this has China and India in them. It has United Arab Emirates and Iran. It has Egypt and Ethiopia. These countries are rivals. So I think it's better to compare it to the European community after World War II when they tried to get countries like Germany and France into the same bloc. In other words, they pursue security with other members against security against non-members. So I wouldn't put it in the category of alliance at all. But the Russians and Chinese obviously have a lot in common. In security issues, the Russians see their main threat coming from the West. The Chinese see the main threat coming from the eastern border. So they both see the US containment as being the main challenge. So they have this back to back, which tends to work. They also have the proximity, which is a benefit because when, for example, Russia is tied to Germany, you have middle countries like Ukraine, which can be disrupted to disconnect them. You don't have this between the Chinese and the Russians. The Russians have just a vast amount of resources. China is this, well, effectively a Germany on steroids. So you have this massive industrial power which need these resources. No, I think overall they don't have this necessarily vision for an alliance system or bloc politics, and I think that's a positive aspect. And this is also why I think the analogy of the old Cold War applied now, it doesn't really apply because no, I think you're correct. Russia and China are not gonna come and fight together in Ukraine, but obviously the Chinese will supply Russia with support, be it economic or military supplies, so it doesn't get defeated. And as I mentioned before, a good reason for this is when they hear American leaders speak about once they're done with Russia, they can focus on China. And at the same, and the next week they travel to China, ask them to help them break Russia. It's not a national interest of them. So,
Artin.
Yeah, thank you. Glenn, I wanted to ask you more about BRICS. I mean, there's a summit later this month in Russia. So could you maybe tell the audience what this organization is about, what it does, but more specifically, what can we expect from this meeting and maybe what challenges or opportunities are facing BRICS or BRICS Plus?
Well, challenges. I was speaking to Jim Rogers 2 weeks ago, and he was making the point that he didn't have that much faith in it because it was effectively, Goldman Sachs just looking at a map and putting some letters together. And I don't really disagree with that. I think that's a good point, but I think, but I also think that there's a huge demand at the moment for an alternative economic infrastructure, and I think that when there's also therefore a demand for an institutions which can facilitate this. So if you look at what the main things on the agenda probably would be, it's well, first of all, they have to deal with the membership because they have a long queue of states which would like to join, including Turkey, which is interesting as a NATO member, but also with this huge new sanctions war, there is a need to accommodate all this because the rest of the world looks at what's been happening over the past few years. They see this economic war against China, where this efforts to disrupt supply chains, roll back its technological development. They see what's happened to Russia in terms of effectively stealing its sovereign funds, and you have the secondary sanctions. So a key issue will also be developing new payment systems because there's a lot of concern about the dollar for two reasons. One is the debt seems to be becoming unsustainable in terms, I think 35.5 trillion now, and there doesn't seem to be much push for fiscal discipline. And at the same time, there's a weaponization they see of the dollar as not just the dollar, but access to American technologies and banks and payment system like SWIFT. Everything can be weaponized. So I think this is not a once-off. I think this is a bigger trend which the BRICS are trying to adjust to, as it's often pointed out that a lot of this economic the US acting more as a benign hegemon, it's often much like the British, dependent on when it's a comfortable hegemon. Once it becomes, once there's rival out there which can outcompete it, there's a tendency to revert into more neo-mercantilist practices in which the administrative control over the international economy is used to knock down or hold back other rising centers of power. So I think this is to a large extent what they want to respond to. So I know the Russians also want to look at how they can build on the grain corridor they developed. They would like to have some more commodity exchanges. They would like to, across the border have more cooperation between different tech centers. So their list of things to do is quite large. But again, I think the long line of countries seeking membership is also quite an important part of this meeting.
Question from the audience, but that one does also, though, see a considerable degree of in Asia of balancing against the rise of China on the part of countries of East Asia, or some of them, the Japanese, the Vietnamese in particular, and the Filipinos. How far is, in fact, US global hegemony being shored up by local allies acting not for the liberal international order, but simply out of classical local security fears?
Well, I think there's some fears there which opens up for the US to expand its alliance system, but when it comes to Russia, they often find that because in the past, in the 19th and 20th century, the Russians, they both had the intention and almost capability of pursuing hegemony in Eurasia. I think what you're seeing now is with economic connectivity, how do you soft balance the Chinese, and this is don't make the Russians too dependent on China. This is often what countries see, which is why before the war, the Japanese, they were reaching out to Russia because they knew that if the Russians, if they wouldn't have more economic connectivity because of the disputes over the Northern Kurils, then the Russians would lean too heavy towards the Russians, and in any dispute between China and Japan, the Russians would lean towards China. The same logic was played out in India, where they recognized they also have to connect closer to Russia to have a balance of dependence. Even the Europeans, the Germans, the French said, before 2022, we can't push the Russians too hard because then they're going to end up with China. So what we're talking about is a balance of dependence. You would like all countries to have a diversified. So I think that this is the economic aspect, which will, I think, naturally balance itself out. I think, ironically, it's a lot of the US policies when they, for example, asking the Indians to disconnect from the Iranians. This makes the Iranians more dependent on China. They ask everyone to disconnect from Russia. Russia becomes more dependent on China. So I think a lot of these policies, they're counterproductive because I think a natural balance of dependence or balance of power would establish itself if there wasn't that much intervention. But of course, in terms of military power, I think it can be expected for the Chinese to militarize more. They see the dangers across the horizon, and they will militarize more. Their main military security objectives is to punch a hole through these two island chains set up after World War II, which Dulles outlined quite nicely. And this entails dominating the South China Sea and also encouraging neighbors to abandon this American alliance system. But we often see that their actions are to some extent counterproductive, with the Philippines obviously being a key example, and they appear to be playing the cards a bit more cautious with the Vietnamese, but no, but overall, there will, with the rising China, there will always be tensions in some tensions in the region. So yeah, so it's yeah, there, I don't think there's only peace on the horizon.
In Europe, where the European Union appears to have become almost a kind of political and economic uh, front for NATO in recent years. But do you see political movements in European populations as having the ability to seriously to change or undermine this in the years to come?
Yes, because, well, the EU is becoming a bit of a contradiction. I remember when I was a student in the early 2000s, you know, or also if you listen to the rhetoric of Russia in the now of the EU in the 90s, it was we spoke about the normative power Europe, ethical power, civilian power, all of these terms. So it was going to be anything else but geopolitical. But now it's obviously geopolitical. But whenever the EU saw crisis around the world, it always had the same recipe, which was, you know, even if you can't come to an agreement, at least sit down and talk, make peace. And now that we have war in Europe, they're saying the exact opposite. There can't be any compromise. We can't even sit down and talk to the Russians. So they're no longer following anything which they previously said. Instead, we have, you know, the cheering on Stoltenberg when he says weapons are the path to peace. Diplomacy legitimizes Putin. We can't legitimize our opponents. So, and of course, when the Hungarians attempted to restore diplomacy by traveling to Kiev, Moscow, and Beijing, the EU began to punish them. So it's quite radical, and I guess many people have read the statements by Kaja Kallas, which is becoming the new EU foreign policy chief. She's you know, called for breaking up Russia into smaller pieces, smaller countries, and much like the Polish president, and also arguing, yeah, as I said before, we don't have diplomacy with war criminals. So it's very strange from the EU. So this is causing a lot of opposition, both from the political left and the political right, which is why you see, for example, in Germany, when they talk about AfD, it's very right wing, yes, but they're actually calling for diplomacy with the Russians. So yeah, the French have an interesting word to call it the radical center, and I think that's what we to a large extent have now in Europe. That is the center has become very radical, and on further out on the left and right, you actually find this new political forces, which is able to accommodate the vacuum left behind by the political center. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for it to be made, but given that it's both political left and right, they can be played against each other, and that goes back to my example with the French. They had an election. Macron's party comes in third, but they can play the left and right off each other, and the least successful party ends up sitting ruling. So it's, but I think again, it's temporary.
And several questions about how you would see the possibility of peace in Ukraine. Do you think it's possible? And if so, how and along what lines?
Well, I think the Russians won't accept anything less than what they call Istanbul Plus. So it's worth remembering that in Istanbul, this was in early 2022, the Russians, of course, they had expressed frustration for the 7 years which the Minsk Accords or Minsk Agreement was not implemented. So when they invaded in early 2022, they pushed they pushed for new negotiations. This is often not covered well in the media, but the Russians actually contacted Zelensky on the first day of the invasion, which is confirmed by Zelensky. On the third day, they agreed to start negotiations. But as also everyone recognized then, from the Ukrainian side, the Russian, the mediators, be it the Turkish and the Israeli, they all recognized that the Russians were willing to compromise on most things, with one exception. They wouldn't that was the neutrality of Ukraine. So this war was about no NATO. They were willing to go back to where they had been, so pull out all of their forces. But the one condition they wouldn't compromise on was restoring Ukraine's neutrality. So, and this was the deal that was on the table in 2022, which they were convinced to reject. And after this, of course, we've had war. And once they rejected this peace, the Russians were more or less trapped in Ukraine in this war, and it became a war of attrition. And this is what we've been seeing for 2.5 years. That is a war where each side is trying to bleed each other dry. And so in this process, the Russians have annexed, of course, these 4 territories: Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. And you know, to some extent, this was because they didn't see a possibility of well, can call it responsible governance, but it was also because of the occupation. That is, if you occupy all these territories, you also need to have cooperation with local governance. Now, if you're planning on leaving thereafter and all the people who worked with you become traitors or punished, this is not very attractive. So there's many reasons why they annexed these territories, but it's worth noting that this happened over the past 2.5 years. So this is my point. They're not gonna they're gonna keep the territories. They can maybe negotiate. I assume they give themselves some room for maneuver to negotiate, where maybe changing the administrative borders, so keeping what the territory they have. Again, Putin doesn't talk to me, so I'm not sure how flexible they are. But overall, I think this is what they want: Istanbul plus. So neutrality for Ukraine is a must, and then of course the territorial concessions as a result of this war. And yeah, if they can't get the neutrality for Ukraine, I think they will go for a complete victory, because what Stoltenberg and other Western leaders keep saying is, once the war is over, Ukraine going to join NATO. So it sounds very moral and virtuous, but what it's actually signaling to the Russians is, once the war is over, NATO will take the territory or move in on the territory which you haven't captured yet. So I think this incentivizes Russia to at least take the historical Russian territory, which also happens to be the very strategic one. So everything from Odessa to Kharkov, where the natural resources are, the fertile soil, and of course the ports, access to the Black Sea. And they will probably wreck, I think, the rest of Ukraine to make it less attractive for NATO. So this is why it often sounds very attractive to say, no, NATO expansion is non-negotiable, but it sounds morally righteous, but it's effectively condemning Ukraine to a very horrible and ugly victory, and ugly peace for the Russians as well. So yeah, I think Istanbul plus or the destruction of Ukraine is what's now on the table.
Artin?
I was going to ask the same question, but do you see any other scenarios in the next year or so in terms of fighting in Ukraine that is not leading to the complete destruction? Or do you think the fighting will continue and we will get to a point where negotiations are supported because that reality becomes recognized? How do you see that?
Well, I think the problem is, because the Russians see this as an existential threat, there's no way they're going to be able to accept Ukraine in NATO. But it's also worth noting that I think often we're given the false impression that this war has stagnated, because we only look at the territorial borders, which has shifted quite slowly. But this is not a good measuring indicator of measurement for how the war is going, because again, this is a war of attrition. And as we know, in a war of attrition, if you storm well-fortified lines, you're going to lose a lot of troops, a lot of equipment. And so it's often in the interest to bleed the adversary sufficiently first until its defensive lines are weakened, and then you take the territory. So I think, so if we do use the real measurement, you will want to see the casualty rates and the losses. And again, I think the Russians are dominating within their artillery. I think it's like between 7 or 10 to 1. It's extreme. And also with the drones, the air power, the glide bombs, electronic warfare, so armored vehicles. And this is the key problem for the Ukrainians now. They're running out of manpower. They're trying to fill the gaps with more aggressive recruitment by, well, essentially taking people who don't want to be there. But this is causing other problems, like social unrest. It's more desertions, surrenders, unreliable front lines. So I don't see how this can be turned around. With every time Ukraine runs into deep trouble, NATO has an option. We can either negotiate with the Russians or escalate. And I think at every turn we tend to escalate, which is why now the latest thing, which you might agree on now in about 4 days' time, is to send these missiles, which will effectively be operated by British and American technicians, which the Russians have already said they would consider a direct attack on Russia. And just a final point. This was Biden's word. If you remember 2 years ago, he said, we can't send F-16s. This is World War III. Now we do. So obviously we're pushing this, going up this escalatory ladder. But I think we reached the end of it. Either NATO has to go to war with Russia with unforeseen consequences, or we accept the defeat, that we either negotiate or allow Ukraine to collapse. But I think we're reaching the end of the line, as the Ukrainians can't go on for much longer. Again, a few more months, but what's happening now on the ground is quite horrific. Also, as the front lines are collapsing, the casualties are only intensifying. So it's I guess from only a humanitarian perspective, it's starting to look cruel not to negotiate or at least restore diplomacy.
We have well, not fun, but because we're running out of time, but one last question. I mean, is sympathy for your views growing in Europe as, what's happening becomes clearer and clearer? Are people gradually coming round to a recognition that this is necessary, or are you still feeling extremely isolated?
I think it's changing a bit, because there was a very strong propaganda narrative when this war began. We said it was unprovoked, and this was everyone repeated this, and this was quite important, because once you say something is unprovoked, that means the Russians are only looking. This is an opportunism. So everyone kind of recognized, well, if they just want to restore the Soviet Union or conquer some territory, then a good decision is to send weapons, and that's what everyone did. But in order to elevate the cost for military opportunism. But I think more people are coming to recognize that because the Russians sees this an existential threat, we can either march towards nuclear war, or just see the Russians willing to go escalate as far as necessary. And as we see, they're now changing their nuclear doctrine. So it's quite it's quite dramatic. But I also think that more information has been coming out, because keep in mind that some of the key narratives was not just unprovoked, but you can't even negotiate with the Russians. But now a lot of this information coming about what happened actually in early 2022. Even Zelensky, if we look back at this Economist interview he did in March, because he even said to the Economist, there's these countries in the West who would like a long war, so to exhaust the Russians, even if this means the destruction of Ukraine and death of our people. So this was not acceptable. But of course, a few weeks later, then we knew that he got this offer of getting all the weapons he would need if he would choose war, and they took this, and this has been now confirmed over and over again from many holds. So this is I think this changes a lot of the equation. And I think also, as we see the Ukrainians losing on the battlefield, there's the media has begun to prepare the public that we'll fight to the end. There can't be any negotiations with the Russians. You already seen the narrative changing. So Zelensky has to be more realistic. We're finding the scapegoats. We are changing the narrative. So I think all of this is changing the attitudes a little bit, but it's still this assumption underpinning everything. Because I speak a lot of places in Europe, and there's always this idea that if you're trying to explain the security interest of Russia, again, a key necessity if you want to mitigate security competition, then you're legitimizing it, and you're also providing support for it. So you have to be condemned. This is part of our our morality these days. But I think more and more people are waking up.
Struggle continues. Well, Glenn, thank you so much. Once again, I strongly recommend Glenn's book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. I hope you will all buy it. Thank you, Artin. Thank you to the audience. I'm sorry that I couldn't get around to all your questions. And Glenn, we look forward to seeing you again with QI in future.
Yeah, Anatol, Artin, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.